At 74, Harold and his wife Evelyn were thrown out of their own home by the children they raised, left with just a few dollars and nowhere to go. 3 days later, they bought a collapsing cabin deep in the woods for almost nothing. What they found inside would change everything. If you believe it's never too late to rebuild, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories like this. The house on Cedar Lane had never been impressive, not in the way people admired things from a distance, but it had always been enough for Harold and Evelyn Whitaker, and for 45 years, that had meant everything. It was a narrow, weathered home with pale siding that had long since lost its original color, a front porch that creaked under familiar footsteps, and a backyard garden that seemed to bloom not because of soil or sunlight, but because Evelyn refused to let it do otherwise. Every morning followed the same quiet rhythm, one that had grown softer with age but never truly faded. Harold would wake first, because sleep no longer held him the way it once did. He would sit on the edge of the bed for a moment, steadying himself before standing, his right hand instinctively reaching for the dresser to compensate for the lingering weakness left behind by the stroke 2 years earlier. He didn't talk about it much. He didn't talk about most things anymore. Evelyn would follow shortly after, her movements slower, more careful, the stiffness in her joints making itself known with every step she took across the worn wooden floor. Her fingers, once quick and precise, now curved slightly inward from years of arthritis, yet she still insisted on using them, especially for breakfast. "Sit," she would say gently whenever Harold tried to help. "You've done enough in your life." And Harold would obey, not because he believed her, but because he knew it mattered to her that he did. The kitchen smelled the same every morning: toast, weak coffee, sometimes eggs if they could afford them that week. The small table by the window held 2 chairs, always pulled out at slight angles, as if ready for conversation that rarely needed to be spoken aloud. They didn't need many words anymore. Sometimes Harold would glance out at the backyard, where the garden stretched in uneven rows, and he would remember the years when he built the raised beds with his own hands, when his body responded without hesitation, when the idea of slowing down had felt like something that happened to other people. Evelyn noticed those moments. She always did. "It's still growing," she would say softly, placing a plate in front of him, and Harold would nod, even when he wasn't looking at the plants. They lived on a combination of Social Security and a modest pension Harold had earned from decades of carpentry work, the kind that didn't make headlines but quietly held the world together. It was enough to cover groceries, utilities, and the rising property taxes that seemed to creep up a little more each year. Just enough. There was no room for mistakes. That was why, when Daniel started visiting more often, Harold felt something shift, even before he understood what it meant. Their son had always been sharp, the kind of man who knew how to talk his way through a room, who dressed well even on casual days, who seemed to carry a sense of urgency about everything he did. "Market's changing," Daniel said one afternoon, standing in the living room with his hands in his pockets, as if measuring the house against something unseen. "You've got equity here, real value. You shouldn't just sit on it." Harold didn't respond right away. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in the quiet effort it took him to keep up with conversations that moved faster than he liked. "We're sitting just fine," he said eventually. Evelyn, standing near the doorway, smiled in that gentle way she used when she wanted to smooth over tension before it could take shape. Daniel smiled back, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not about now," he continued. "It's about later. If something happens, probate could take months. Fees, legal, mess, it's unnecessary. You could just transfer the deed early. Make things easier for everyone. Everyone." The word lingered in the room, light on the surface, heavy underneath. Claire began visiting more often too, though her approach was softer, wrapped in concern rather than logic. "You shouldn't be alone out here," she said one evening, sitting beside Evelyn on the couch, her hand resting lightly over her mother's. "What if something happens? What if you fall? There are places that could take care of you properly." Evelyn's smile didn't fade, but something behind it did. "This is our home," she replied quietly. "We've managed so far." Claire nodded, her expression carefully sympathetic. "I know, Mom. I just worry." And for a moment it sounded real, but Harold watched the way her eyes moved, how they lingered on the walls, the furniture, the subtle signs of a house that had been lived in for decades rather than staged for approval. He didn't have proof of anything, not yet, but he felt the same quiet unease that had started when Daniel first mentioned equity. It wasn't loud. It settled slowly, like a draft you couldn't quite locate but knew was there. What Harold and Evelyn didn't know, what they had no reason to suspect, was that Daniel's urgency wasn't about protecting them from legal complications. It was about something else entirely, something he hadn't mentioned at the dinner table, something tied to decisions made far from Cedar Lane, in offices where risk and reward blurred together until one became the other. And Claire's concern, as gentle as it sounded, wasn't rooted in fear for her parents' safety. It was tied to a future she was trying to secure for herself, one that required money she didn't currently have, money that could be unlocked if certain choices were made. The house, to Harold and Evelyn, was a lifetime. To their children, it was something else, something that could be converted, rearranged, leveraged. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the light in the living room turned golden and thin, Harold sat quietly in his chair while Evelyn folded laundry nearby. "Do you ever feel," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "like something's changing, and we're the last ones to notice?" Evelyn paused, her hands resting on a worn shirt that had been Harold's favorite for years. She didn't answer immediately. Then, she looked up at him, her eyes soft, but searching. "I think," she said gently, "things have been changing for a while." Harold nodded, though he wasn't sure if he understood what she meant. Outside, the garden shifted slightly in the evening breeze, leaves brushing against one another in a quiet, steady rhythm. Inside, the house held its silence, as it always had. But for the first time in decades, it no longer felt entirely safe. The unease Harold had felt in the quiet corners of his home did not arrive all at once. And when it finally took shape, it did so in the form of paperwork that looked harmless enough to pass across a kitchen table. Daniel had chosen a Sunday afternoon, the kind that used to belong to family meals and slow conversations, and he brought with him a folder that seemed too organized for something meant to be simple. Claire sat beside Evelyn, her voice soft and reassuring, her presence carefully measured so that nothing felt abrupt. "It's just a precaution," Daniel said, placing the papers down with deliberate calm. "We're not taking anything from you. This just makes things easier later. Avoids complications." Harold leaned forward, squinting slightly at the pages as if clarity might come from looking harder, but the words moved too fast, filled with terms that sounded official without being understandable. Evelyn glanced between the two children, searching their faces for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that might suggest this was more than what it appeared to be. But she found only patience, the kind that presses gently until resistance feels unreasonable. "We trust you," she said quietly, more to herself than to them. Harold hesitated for a moment longer, his hand resting on the pen, feeling the weight of something he could not name. But when Evelyn placed her hand over his, warm despite the stiffness in her fingers, he nodded and signed. The ink dried quickly, leaving behind a decision that could not be undone. For a while, nothing changed, at least not in ways that could be seen. The house remained the same, the garden still grew, and the mornings still carried the same quiet rhythm. But something beneath it had shifted, like a foundation settling in a way that did not immediately crack the walls, but promised that it might. Daniel visited less often after that, which Evelyn took as a sign that everything had been resolved, that their children no longer worried so much because the future had been secured. Claire still came by occasionally, bringing groceries or small things that felt thoughtful. But her visits were shorter, her eyes more distracted, as if she were always thinking about where she needed to be next. Harold noticed it more clearly than he let on. One morning, while fixing a loose cabinet hinge with slow, careful movements, he paused longer than necessary, his hand resting against the wood as if remembering how easily it used to respond. "Feels like we gave something away," he said quietly, not looking up. Evelyn set down the dish she was drying and moved closer, her expression gentle but uncertain. "We didn't give it away," she replied softly. "We just made things simpler." Harold nodded, though the words did not settle inside him the way they should have. Weeks passed in a silence that seemed harmless on the surface, and by the time the truth arrived, it did not come gradually. It came all at once, carried through the front door on a weekday morning, when Harold and Evelyn had expected nothing more than an ordinary day. Daniel came first, his steps purposeful, followed closely by Claire, whose smile was too controlled, and behind them was a man neither Harold nor Evelyn recognized, dressed in a way that suggested confidence rather than familiarity. "Mom, Dad, we need to talk," Daniel said, his tone already settled into something final. The air in the room changed before anyone sat down. They gathered in the living room, the same space where birthdays had been celebrated, where illnesses had been endured, where every version of their family had once existed in some form. and now it felt smaller, as if it were shrinking to contain what was about to be said. Daniel spoke first, his words measured, his voice steady in a way that suggested the conversation had already happened somewhere else, without them. "We've found a buyer for the house," he said. The sentence landed without context, without preparation, and for a moment, Evelyn thought she had misunderstood. "A buyer?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Claire leaned forward, her expression carefully sympathetic. "It's the best option," she said gently. "This house is too much for you now. The maintenance, the risks, being out here alone. It's not safe anymore." Harold's chest tightened, and he pushed himself up slightly in his chair, his voice rising before he could steady it. "This is our home," he said, the words coming out sharper than he intended. Daniel's expression did not change. "It's in our names now," he replied, not unkindly, but without room for argument. "That's why we had you sign the transfer papers, remember? So we could make decisions without delays when the time came." The room seemed to tilt, just slightly, enough for Harold to feel it in the back of his mind, where the edges of his stroke still lingered. Evelyn reached for his arm immediately, her grip tightening as she felt him sway, her own hands trembling despite her effort to remain calm. "We're not asking you to figure this out alone," Claire continued, pulling a brochure from her bag and placing it carefully on the table. "We've already found a place for you. It's quiet, it's safe, and they take care of everything." Evelyn picked up the brochure slowly, her fingers tracing the glossy surface as if it might reveal something hidden beneath the images. The rooms were small, the furniture generic, the smiles in the photos too perfect to be real. "How much is it?" she asked. Daniel answered without hesitation. "We'll cover it from the sale. It's manageable." But Evelyn noticed what he didn't say. The details left out. The way the numbers were never actually spoken. And something inside her tightened in a way that had nothing to do with age. Harold leaned back, his breathing uneven now, his thoughts struggling to catch up with the reality forming in front of him. "And if we don't agree?" he asked, his voice quieter, but heavier. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if this part had always been expected. "The house is already under contract," he said. "The paperwork has been moving for weeks, and the buyers expect possession soon. We need it empty." The man standing behind them shifted slightly, his presence suddenly more noticeable, and Harold turned his head just enough to see him more clearly. He carried a leather folder and wore the measured patience of someone used to closing property deals, and his posture did not belong in a family conversation. Evelyn followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she studied the stranger. And in that brief moment, something connected in a way that made her chest tighten. She had seen that man before, not here, but somewhere else. Standing beside Daniel, speaking quietly in a way that suggested familiarity rather than business, and the realization settled slowly, painfully, as she lowered the brochure back onto the table without another word, her hand lingering there for just a second too long. The realization Evelyn felt in that living room did not leave her overnight, and in the days that followed, it settled into something quieter but far more permanent, like a truth that no longer needed to be spoken because it had already been accepted. Harold moved through the house more slowly than usual, not because his body demanded it, but because every object seemed to ask for one last look, one last moment of recognition, before it became something that no longer belonged to him. They did not argue with their children again, not after that conversation, because there was nothing left to argue that had not already been decided elsewhere. The date came faster than either of them expected. It arrived on a gray morning that carried the kind of cold that seeped through walls and into bone, the kind that made even familiar places feel distant. A truck pulled up in front of the house, not with the careful presence of people who came to help, but with the efficiency of those who came to finish something already in motion. Harold opened the door before they knocked, as if he had been waiting, and in a way, halt. The men who stepped inside did not look at him for long. They carried clipboards and spoke in low voices, already walking past him, already assessing what needed to be moved, what needed to be taken, what needed to be cleared. "Just the large items," one of them said, without meeting Harold's eyes. "We've got instructions." Instructions! Evelyn stood near the hallway, her hands clasped together, not because she didn't know what to do, but because she was trying to keep them from trembling. No one had asked if they needed help packing. No one had asked what they wanted to keep. They had been told. Harold moved toward the corner of the living room where his old wooden toolbox sat, the same one he had used for decades, its surface worn smooth by time and use. He bent down slowly, lifting it with both hands, adjusting his grip as his right side struggled to keep balance. But he did not ask for help. Not from the strangers in his home. Not from anyone. Evelyn packed differently. She did not reach for things of value. She reached for things that could not be replaced. A small stack of photographs. Edges, softened by years of handling. A faded sweater that once belonged to Daniel when he was a child. The fabric stretched at the sleeves from where Evelyn had rolled them up too many times. Her mother's Bible. The spine cracked but intact. Pages filled with notes written in a hand she could still recognize even after all these years. And the ring. She held it for a moment longer than the others, her fingers tightening slightly before she slipped it into her pocket instead of the suitcase. The rest stayed behind. 45 years of a life reduced. Not by time, but by decision. The men worked quickly, their movements efficient, almost practiced. Lifting furniture, carrying boxes, clearing rooms that had once held birthdays, arguments, quiet evenings, and everything in between. Harold stepped outside at one point, needing air that did not feel borrowed, and his eyes drifted toward the mailbox at the edge of the yard. It stood slightly open, the small metal door not fully closed, something he would have noticed immediately under normal circumstances. He walked toward it slowly, each step deliberate, and when he reached it, he pulled it open fully. Empty. Not just empty, but cleaned out in a way that felt deliberate. No letters, no bills, no county notices. Harold remembered how odd it had seemed in recent weeks, that the mailbox had grown lighter, while Daniel kept insisting he was helping them stay ahead of paperwork. Nothing. Harold stood there longer than he should have, his hand resting against the cold metal, as everything began to align. The missing notices, the delayed bills, the silence Daniel had dismissed. Standing there, Harold understood it had never been routine. Someone had been controlling what reached them. He closed the mailbox slowly, his expression unchanged, but something inside him shifted. Something deeper than anger, something closer to understanding. Inside, Evelyn watched through the front window as a dark SUV pulled into the driveway. The same one she had seen before. The same one that carried the man from the living room. He stepped out, speaking briefly with the movers. His gestures confident, familiar, as if he already belonged there. Evelyn's gaze drifted past him, through the open door, into the space that had once been their dining room. The table was still there, the one Harold had built by hand during their 10th year of marriage, the one where they had celebrated their 40th anniversary just 5 years earlier. She had polished it the night before, not because it would change anything, but because leaving it untouched felt wrong. Now, as she watched, one of the men placed a small label on its surface. 2 words, junk removal. Evelyn did not move. She did not speak. She simply watched as the table was lifted, carried past the doorway, and loaded into the truck as if it were no different from broken wood or discarded scrap. In that moment, something inside her settled, not with resistance but with clarity. It was not just the house. It was everything that had ever happened inside it, reduced, labeled, and removed. By the time the truck was nearly full, there was very little left inside. Harold returned to the front steps, the toolbox still in his hands, and stood beside Evelyn without speaking. They did not look at each other right away. They did not need to. When the last item was carried out, one of the men approached them, holding a clipboard. "That's everything," he said. "You'll need to clear the rest." The rest. 2 boxes. 1 broken suitcase. A life that no longer had a place to stay. The front door closed behind them with a sound that felt louder than it should have. The final echo of something that would not open again. They stood on the sidewalk together, the cold air pressing against them, the weight of what remained at their feet. And for a moment, neither of them moved. Cars passed without slowing. Curtains shifted in nearby windows just slightly, then stilled again. No one came out. No one asked if they needed help. Harold adjusted his grip on the toolbox, his fingers tightening just enough to remind himself that he was still holding something that mattered. And Evelyn pulled her coat closer around her shoulders, her hand resting briefly over the pocket where the ring lay hidden, as if confirming that at least one thing had not been taken. She looked down at the box held at the street ahead, and for the first time since the door had closed, she spoke, her voice steady, but softer than it had ever been before. "We should start walking," she said. Harold nodded, though he did not yet know where they were going. And as he shifted his weight forward, the suitcase handle strained against its worn cord, threatening to give way with every step they had yet to take. They did not get far before the suitcase handle gave out. The frayed cord snapped with a soft, final sound, and the case dropped awkwardly onto the pavement, its weight shifting as if it too had decided it could go no further. Harold bent slowly, adjusting the strap with hands that no longer moved the way they once had, while Evelyn stood beside him, scanning the street as if direction might appear if she looked long enough. They kept walking anyway, step by step, without a destination that made sense, only the instinct to keep moving forward because standing still felt too close to surrender. By the time they reached the bus stop, near the edge of town, the light had thinned into something pale and distant, and the cold had begun to settle deeper into their clothes. The bench was empty, except for a crumpled newspaper left behind by someone who had already moved on. Evelyn noticed it first. She picked it up absent-mindedly at first, smoothing out the wrinkled pages more out of habit than intention. But as her eyes moved across the print, something caught her attention. Something small, buried near the back where few people bothered to look. County auction. Property seized for unpaid taxes. Minimum bid starting low. Some as little as $1. She read it once, then again, more slowly this time, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges of the paper. Harold watched her, not asking, just waiting. Because after so many years, he understood that when Evelyn found something worth noticing, she needed a moment to decide what it meant. "They're auctioning off properties," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. Harold nodded, though he didn't yet see the connection. "Old places," she continued, "abandoned. Some of them condemned." He shifted his weight slightly, the cold pressing against his joints as he glanced down at the boxes beside them. "We barely have enough money left to survive a few more days," he said gently. Evelyn looked at him then, really looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that had not been there before. Something that had moved past fear and into something harder to define. "If we're going to have nothing," she said, "then I want that nothing to belong to us." The words settled between them, simple and impossible at the same time. "I don't want to end up in a place where we're just waiting," she added, her voice softer now, but no less certain. "If we have to struggle, I want it to be somewhere that's ours." Harold did not answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, then at the road ahead, then back at her, and in that moment, he understood that this was not a decision she was asking him to make for her. She had already made it. The county building was not far, but it felt like a different world when they stepped inside. The air was warmer, the lights brighter, and the room itself filled with people who did not look like they had come from where Harold and Evelyn had just been. Men in clean jackets, women with folders tucked neatly under their arms, voices low but confident as they discussed numbers, locations, opportunities. When Harold and Evelyn entered, the room shifted slightly, not loudly, but enough to be felt. Heads turned, not out of curiosity alone, but out of something sharper, something that measured them quickly and dismissed them just as fast. Evelyn tightened her grip on the newspaper, folding it smaller as if that might make them less noticeable. But there was no way to disappear in a room where they clearly did not belong. They found seats near the back, close enough to hear, far enough to avoid attention, and for a while, they simply listened. Properties were announced one by one. Some drew interest immediately, numbers rising quickly as bids moved back and forth between people who understood the value of what they were buying. Others passed with little comment, noted and dismissed in seconds. Then came the listing that changed everything. "Next property," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying the practiced rhythm of someone who had done this many times before. "Blackthorn Hollow Road. Small cabin structure, partially collapsed roof, no utilities, access road unmaintained, property condemned, recommended for demolition." A few people chuckled quietly. The description continued, each detail stripping away any remaining appeal until what remained was not a house, but a liability. Starting bid, $1. Silence followed. No movement, no interest. The auctioneer glanced up, scanning the room, waiting for someone, anyone to respond. But the silence held, steady and complete. He cleared his throat lightly. "If there are no bids, we'll move on." Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, not hesitation, but something closer to inevitability, as if the moment had already been decided long before they arrived. Harold felt it too, though differently. He saw the way her fingers pressed into the paper, the way her shoulders held just a little too still, the way she blinked once, quickly, as if holding something back. He had seen that before. Not often, only in moments when she refused to let the world see what it had done to her. His hand moved before his mind caught up with it. $6, he said. his voice rough, slightly uneven, but clear enough to be heard. The room broke into laughter. It was not cruel in the way that anger is cruel. It was something lighter, more careless, the kind that dismissed without thinking twice. $6? Someone repeated, amusement evident. Guess they're buying themselves a cabin, another voice added, followed by a low ripple of laughter that spread through the room. Harold did not respond. He kept his hand raised just long enough for it to matter, then lowered it slowly, his expression unchanged, though his heart was beating faster than it had in years. The property had drawn no interest at all, and the clerk, after a brief exchange with the auctioneer, treated the bid less like a sale anyone wanted and more like a liability the county was relieved to unload. The auctioneer looked at him for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze shifting from Harold to Evelyn, then back again, something uncertain passing through his expression. "Sir," he said carefully, "you understand the condition of this property?" Harold nodded once. "It's not livable," the auctioneer continued. "No heat, no water, no access in winter. It's not a place anyone would stay." Evelyn stood then, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a quiet steadiness that drew the room's attention in a different way. "If nowhere else is willing to take us," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, "then maybe that place will." The laughter faded. Not entirely, but enough to leave space for something else. The auctioneer held her gaze for a moment longer, then looked back at his list, as if weighing something he could not quite explain, and the room waited, not with interest, but with curiosity now, watching what would happen next as he lifted the gavel slightly, hesitating just long enough for the silence to return. The gavel came down, and just like that, the room moved on. There were no congratulations, no acknowledgement that what had just happened might matter to anyone beyond the paperwork that followed. Harold signed where he was told, his hand unsteady but determined, while Evelyn stood beside him, holding the folded newspaper as if it were something far more valuable than it appeared. By the time they stepped outside, the light had already begun to fade, and for the first time since the house on Cedar Lane had closed behind them, they had an address, even if neither of them knew exactly what waited there. Mason Reed found them before they had a chance to figure out their next step. He had been standing near the side of the building, watching the auction from a distance, his eyes lingering long enough to notice the way Harold held himself and the way Evelyn stood without asking for anything. "You folks heading out toward Blackthorn?" he asked, his voice calm without judgment. Harold hesitated, then nodded. Mason glanced at the sky, then back at them. "You're not making that trip on foot tonight," he said simply. "I've got a truck." The drive was longer than either of them expected. The paved roads gave way to narrower stretches, then to uneven paths that seemed to disappear into the trees, the forest thickening around them until the world beyond the headlights felt distant and unreachable. No one spoke much. Evelyn watched the passing darkness, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while Harold kept his gaze forward, measuring distance without knowing how to define it anymore. When Mason finally slowed the truck and turned onto what could barely be called a road, the tires crunching over gravel and loose earth, Harold felt something tighten in his chest, not from fear, but from the weight of what they had chosen. "This is it," Mason said quietly. The headlights fell across the structure slowly, revealing it piece by piece, not all at once, as if the darkness itself was reluctant to let it be seen fully. The cabin leaned slightly to one side, its frame warped by time and neglect. The roof sagged in the middle, a section of it torn open as if something had forced its way through years ago and never been repaired. The door hung crooked on its hinges, barely attached, and the windows were nothing more than empty spaces where glass had once existed. It was worse than the description. Much worse. Evelyn stepped out of the truck first, her foot touching the ground carefully, her body pausing for a moment as the cold air settled around her, sharper here, deeper than it had been in town. Harold followed, gripping the side of the truck as he lowered himself, his cane pressing into the dirt as he found his balance. Neither of them spoke. Mason exhaled slowly, looking at the cabin, then at them. "I can stay a bit," he said. "Get you started." Harold nodded, unable to find the words, and together they moved toward the door. It resisted at first, swollen from years of moisture, but Harold pressed his shoulder against it, ignoring the strain in his weakened side, until it gave way with a dull crack, opening just enough to let them step inside. The smell hit them immediately. Damp wood, mold, something older and heavier beneath it, something that had settled into the walls and floors over years of abandonment. Evelyn's hand tightened around the doorframe for a moment, her breath catching, but she stepped forward anyway, The floor shifted under Harold's weight, not collapsing, but unstable enough to remind him that every step mattered. Mason moved quickly, his actions efficient, pulling a tarp from the back of the truck, climbing carefully onto what remained of the roof structure, securing it as best he could over the open section where the sky had been visible. It was not a repair. It was a delay. Inside, Evelyn found a relatively clear space near one wall, brushing aside debris with slow, deliberate movements, her hands already beginning to redden from the cold and the rough surfaces. She did not complain. She did not mention the pain settling into her joints or the medication she could no longer afford. She simply worked. Mason brought in a small lantern, setting it on the floor, its light flickering just enough to push back the darkness without fully removing it. "Got some water," he said, placing a bottle beside it, "and a couple cans." Evelyn nodded, her voice soft. "Thank you." When he finally left, the sound of his truck faded quickly, swallowed by the trees, leaving behind a silence that felt larger than the space itself. For a while, they moved without speaking, adjusting what little they had, placing the boxes near the wall, laying out a thin layer of fabric between them and the floor, trying to create something that could be called rest. The cold crept in slowly. Then, all at once, Harold sat down heavily, his back against the wall, his breath visible in the dim light, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to steady himself. Evelyn lay beside him, pulling her coat tighter, her body curling slightly as if that might preserve what warmth remained. Somewhere in the structure, something shifted, wood settling, or something else. The sound repeated, faint but present, and Harold opened his eyes, scanning the shadows, his gaze moving across the floor where the lantern light barely reached. That was when he saw it. A mark, faint, carved into one of the floorboards near the far corner, partially obscured by dirt and time, but deliberate enough to stand out once noticed. Letters, or something close to them. He leaned forward slightly, squinting, trying to make sense of the shapes, but the light was too weak, the angle wrong. He could have said something. He almost did, but he didn't. Because in that moment, it felt like something too fragile to disturb, something that might mean nothing. And he did not want to give Evelyn another reason to hope for something that might not be there. So he leaned back again, saying nothing. The night stretched longer than it should have. At some point, Evelyn's breathing changed, uneven, quieter, and Harold turned his head just enough to listen more closely. He heard it then. The soft sound she tried to hide. Not loud, not enough to break the silence, but enough for him to know. She was crying. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, careful. There was a pause. Then, "I'm fine," she whispered. Harold nodded, though she could not see it, and turned his face slightly toward the wall, his eyes closing again. Not because he was tired, but because he did not know how to fix what had already been broken, and the weight of that truth settled heavier than the cold pressing through the floor as the lantern flickered once, then steadied, casting long shadows across the marked board that neither of them fully understood yet. The mark on the floor did not leave Harold's mind, even as the night finally gave way to a pale, reluctant morning. He woke before the light, fully reached the broken edges of the cabin, his body stiff, his chest tight from the cold air he had breathed all night. And for a moment he stayed still, listening, making sure Evelyn was still there beside him. Her breathing was shallow but steady. That was enough to begin. They did not speak much that morning. There was no plan laid out between them. No discussion about how to fix something that clearly could not be fixed all at once. Only an understanding that if they did not start, then nothing would change, and if nothing changed, then they would not last long enough to see another morning like this. Harold moved first. He pushed himself up carefully, testing his balance, then reached for the nearest piece of broken wood, dragging it aside, clearing a space that might one day become something more stable than what it was now. Each movement was slow, deliberate, shaped by the limitations of a body that no longer obeyed without question. Evelyn worked differently. She stayed closer to the ground, sorting through what had been left behind, separating what might still be used from what had already been lost to time. A rusted pan that could still hold water, a piece of cloth that could be washed and reused, a cracked container that might still serve a purpose if handled carefully. She found the rhythm quickly, not because it was easy, but because she needed it to be. Later that morning, she followed the faint sound of running water she had heard during the night, moving slowly through the trees until she found the creek Mason had mentioned. It was narrow, its surface broken by small rocks, but it was moving, clear enough to reflect the sky in places where the light reached it. She knelt carefully, dipping her hands into the water, wincing slightly at the cold, but not pulling away. This was something they could use, something they could depend on. When she returned, her steps were slower, her legs protesting the distance more than she let herself acknowledge. But she carried what she could, and Harold did not ask how difficult it had been because he already knew. They ate sparingly. The cans Mason had left, along with a few extra supplies he returned with 2 days later, were stretched across days, not meals, and Evelyn measured each portion with care, making sure there would always be something left for tomorrow, even if tomorrow came with more need than they could meet. By afternoon, the cold began to settle in again. Not as sharply as the night before, but persistent enough to remind them that it would return stronger once the sun disappeared. Harold focused on the floor. There were gaps large enough to see the ground beneath, spaces where the wood had rotted through completely, and he gathered stones from outside, placing them carefully into those openings, building something solid where there had been nothing. It was not perfect. It did not need to be. It just needed to hold. The accident happened quickly. One moment he was shifting his weight forward, testing the stability of a board that looked no worse than the others, and the next, it gave way beneath him, splitting with a sharp crack that echoed through the cabin. His leg dropped through the opening, his body twisting as he tried to catch himself, the sudden movement pulling at muscles that were no longer strong enough to respond the way they once had. Evelyn was at his side before he could fully react, her hands gripping his arm, her breath catching as she tried to steady him without losing her own balance. "Don't move," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. Harold nodded, though his jaw had already clenched against the pain. And for a moment, neither of them spoke as they worked together to pull his leg free without making the damage worse. When he finally sat back, his breathing uneven, his face pale, Evelyn kept her hand on his arm a moment longer than necessary, as if confirming he was still there, still whole. It could have been worse. They both knew it. If the fall had been just slightly different, if the board had given way in another direction, if his balance had not held at the last second, then everything they had left might have ended in that single moment. They did not say it out loud. They did not need to. That evening, as the light faded again, Evelyn searched the kitchen area more carefully, moving debris aside with more intention, her eyes scanning not just for what could be used, but for anything that might have been overlooked. That was when she found the jar. It was tucked beneath what had once been a counter, partially hidden by collapsed wood and dirt. Its lid rusted but still sealed tightly enough to protect what was inside. She pried it open slowly, her fingers stiff, her breath held without realizing it, and when the lid finally loosened, she tipped the contents out carefully onto a piece of cloth. Paper. Old, fragile, edges worn and discolored, some parts missing entirely, others barely legible, but still there. Letters. Not many, not complete, but enough to suggest that someone had once lived here long enough to write, to keep, to store pieces of their life in a place they believed would hold them. Evelyn picked one up gently, her eyes tracing the faded ink, trying to make sense of words that time had nearly erased. And for a moment, the cabin felt different. Not empty, not abandoned, but inhabited in a way that lingered beyond what could be seen. She did not call Harold over right away. Instead, she folded the papers back together carefully, placing them aside as if they were something that needed to be protected before it could be understood, her mind already moving through questions she did not yet have answers to. As the cold settled deeper into the walls and Harold shifted slightly in the corner, his gaze drifting once more toward the faint carving in the floor, the shape of it beginning to feel less accidental, less meaningless, as if the pieces they had found were not separate at all, but part of something that had been waiting far longer than they had. The letters Evelyn found did not leave her thoughts, not even as the days continued to demand more immediate concerns like warmth, food, and the slow, careful work of keeping the cabin from collapsing around them. She waited until the light was stronger, until Harold had steadied himself enough to stand, without pain showing in his face, and then she brought the papers to him without saying a word. Harold took them gently, as if they might fall apart at the slightest pressure, his fingers tracing the edges before he even attempted to read them. The ink had faded, but not completely. Names appeared first. Elias. Margaret. The words came in fragments, incomplete sentences, thoughts interrupted by time, but even in their broken state, they carried something that felt deliberate, something that had once been carefully preserved. "They stayed here," Evelyn said softly. Harold nodded, his eyes moving slowly across the page, piecing together what he could. long enough to leave something behind. That realization changed the way they looked at the cabin. It was no longer just a structure that had been abandoned. It was a place that had once held intention. Later that afternoon, Harold climbed carefully toward the section of the cabin where the wood showed signs of old fire damage. The same area he had noticed the night before, where the ceiling dipped lower and the boards darkened unevenly. Evelyn stayed close, not because she could help much with the physical work, but because neither of them trusted the structure enough to be alone in separate spaces. The wall resisted at first, the boards brittle but still held together by age and neglect, and Harold worked slowly, prying them apart one piece at a time, careful not to put too much strain on his weakened side. When the gap finally opened, it did not reveal anything obvious, just darkness. Evelyn leaned closer, holding the lantern higher, and the light slipped into the space, revealing something tucked deeper inside, something hidden not by accident, but by design. A metal box. Small. Sealed. Harold reached in, his arm disappearing into the wall. And for a moment, the weight of what he was holding seemed uncertain, as if it might mean everything or nothing at all. When he pulled it out, the metal surface was cold, worn, but intact. They did not open it immediately. They sat down first, side by side, the box resting between them, the silence stretching just long enough to remind them how rarely anything unexpected had entered their lives before all of this. Evelyn lifted the lid slowly. Inside, there was no gold, no money, no immediate answer to the problems that still surrounded them. There were papers. Not like the letters she had found before. These were organized, intentional, bound together in a way that suggested purpose rather than accident. Notebooks, photographs, pressed plants, flattened carefully between sheets, their shapes preserved even as their color had faded, maps drawn by hand, lines marking paths through the forest, notes written in margins that had begun to blur but not disappear entirely. Harold picked up one of the notebooks, his breath slowing as he turned the first page. The handwriting was precise, measured, each word placed with care. Dates appeared, locations, observations. This was not casual writing. This was work. Evelyn lifted one of the photographs, holding it closer to the light. A woman stood in the frame, her posture steady, her expression serious, not posed for the camera, but captured in a moment of focus. Behind her, the forest stretched, familiar in a way that made Evelyn's chest tighten slightly. "This is her," she said quietly. Harold looked up. "Margaret." The realization settled slowly, not as excitement, but as something deeper, something more complicated. They read together, not rushing, not expecting clarity to come easily, and piece by piece, a story began to take shape. Not complete, not whole, but enough to understand what had once existed here. Elias and Margaret Vale had not come to this place to disappear. They had come to work, to study the forest, the plants, the patterns that others had not noticed or had chosen to ignore. The notebook spoke of species, of changes in the land, of properties that were described with care and precision, as if every detail mattered. But as they read further, something else became clear. The voice that carried the most depth, the most clarity, the most understanding, was not Elias's. It was Margaret's. Her notes were longer, her observations more detailed, her conclusions more certain. And yet, when the name appeared in reference to the work itself, it was almost always his. Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the page. "They wrote about him," she said, her voice quieter now. "Not her." Harold did not respond immediately. He had seen it too. The imbalance. The quiet erasure, hidden inside something that otherwise seemed careful and deliberate. One of the letters, more intact than the others, lay near the bottom of the box, its edges worn but the words still readable enough to carry meaning. Evelyn unfolded it slowly, her eyes moving across the lines, and as she read, her expression shifted, not with surprise, but with something heavier. "She knew," Evelyn said. Harold looked at her. "Knew what?" Evelyn hesitated, then continued. "She knew someone would try to take it." The letter spoke of concern, of pressure from outside, of interests that had nothing to do with understanding and everything to do with ownership. A company had approached them. Timber, medicinal extraction, profit. The words were not dramatic, not exaggerated, but they carried a quiet urgency, a need to protect something that could not be easily replaced. "I have hidden what I can," Margaret had written. "If it is found, let it be by someone who understands that knowledge is not meant to be owned." The sentence lingered in the air between them. Harold leaned back slightly, his eyes moving from the letter to the box, then to the walls around them, as if seeing the cabin for the first time not as something broken, but as something that had been protecting a story long before they arrived. Evelyn closed the letter carefully, placing it back with the others, her hands slower now, more deliberate. "This isn't just something left behind," she said. "It was hidden." Harold nodded once. "For a reason." They sat in silence for a while after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because what they had found did not come with answers that could be used immediately, and the problems waiting outside the box had not disappeared just because something meaningful had been uncovered inside it. The cold still pressed against the walls. The food was still limited. The cabin still barely held together. And whatever this was, whatever it might become, it was not something that could fix those things overnight. Harold reached for the notebook again, his fingers brushing against the edge of a page that seemed slightly thicker than the others, and as he shifted it, something inside the binding moved just enough to suggest that not everything in the box had revealed itself yet. The slight movement inside the notebook did not seem like much at first, but it was enough to change the way Harold held it. Careful now, attentive in a way that suggested he was no longer just reading but searching. He slid his finger along the binding, feeling for the irregularity he had noticed, and with a gentle pressure, a thin folded sheet slipped free, drifting onto his lap as if it had been waiting to be found. Evelyn leaned closer, the lantern light catching the edge of the paper, and for a moment neither of them spoke, both aware that what they were uncovering was no longer accidental. The sheet was not a letter. It was a list. Names of plants, locations marked with coordinates that matched the rough maps in the box, and beside several of them were notes written in a tighter, more urgent hand, Margaret's hand, referencing changes over time, variations that had not been recorded elsewhere. "This is different," Evelyn said softly. Harold nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to piece together what it meant. "It's not just what she saw," he replied. "It's what she knew would disappear." That thought stayed with them long after they had carefully returned the papers to the box, wrapping it again, not out of fear of losing it, but out of respect for something that had been hidden with intention. The next step did not come easily. They could not keep this to themselves, not if it meant what they were beginning to suspect, but they also could not afford to trust blindly, not after everything that had already been taken from them. Mason was the one who bridged that gap. He listened without interrupting, his expression steady as Harold explained what they had found. And when they finished, he did not respond immediately, choosing his words with the same care he used in everything else. "I know someone," he said finally. "She teaches at the state university, studies this kind of thing. She won't jump to conclusions." Dr. Lydia Hart arrived 2 days later, her presence measured, her eyes observant in a way that suggested she noticed everything without reacting to it right away. She did not smile when she entered the cabin. She did not comment on their situation. She simply looked, listened, and then asked to see the materials. Harold watched her closely as she examined the notebooks, the photographs, the pressed plants, her movements precise, controlled, her silence stretching long enough to make every second feel heavier than the last. Evelyn stood nearby, her hands folded, her posture still, not out of calm, but out of the effort it took to remain steady. Finally, Lydia spoke. "It could be authentic," she said, her tone careful, almost distant, "but I can't confirm that yet." The words landed quietly, but they carried weight. Harold nodded, though the slight drop in his shoulders did not go unnoticed. "It's damaged," Lydia continued. "Some of this has degraded too much. Without comparison samples, without proper preservation, it's difficult to establish certainty." Evelyn glanced at Harold, then back at Lydia. "But it means something," she said. Lydia met her gaze then, not dismissive, but honest. "Yes," she replied, "it probably does. But meaning and proof are not the same thing." That distinction lingered long after Lydia left, taking photographs, promising to review them, but offering nothing that could be relied on in the immediate sense. The days that followed did not slow down to accommodate hope. Winter arrived fully, not as a gentle shift, but as a force that demanded attention in ways they were not prepared for. The first heavy snowfall came without warning, covering the narrow path leading to the cabin, cutting them off from what little connection they had to the outside world. The wind found every weakness in the structure, pushing through gaps Harold had not yet sealed, carrying cold that settled deep into the wood, into the floor, into their bones. One night, The section of the roof Harold had repaired gave way under the weight of ice and snow, the tarp tearing loose, the opening widening just enough to let the storm in. Harold worked through it, climbing carefully, securing what he could, his hands numb, his breath uneven, refusing to stop even when his body demanded it. Evelyn watched from below, her heart tightening with every movement he made, knowing that one misstep would be enough to undo everything. The cold took its toll on her more quietly. It settled into her chest, slow at first, then deeper, until her breathing became heavier, her strength fading in ways she could not ignore. She did not tell Harold right away. She did not want to add to what he was already carrying. But the fever came anyway, and when it did not hide. Harold noticed immediately the way she moved slower, the way her voice softened, the way she leaned against the wall just a little longer than before. He used what little money they had left to get medicine from Naomi, the woman who ran the small general store at the edge of the county road. The cost heavier now than it had ever been, not because of the amount, but because of what it meant to spend it. There was no margin left, no room for anything else to go wrong. One evening, after making sure Evelyn had taken what she needed, Harold stepped outside, the cold air hitting him harder than expected, and he sat down on the edge of the small porch, his hands resting on his knees, his head lowering slightly as the weight of everything pressed in at once. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel it fully. Not the anger, not the loss, but the doubt. The quiet question of whether all of this, the work, the struggle, the decision to come here, had been a step forward or simply another way to fall. The thought did not stay long. It could not. Because inside, Evelyn was still breathing, still fighting, and that was enough to bring him back, to push him to stand again, to return to the cabin, to continue. 2 days later, Mason returned, his truck cutting through the snow, his expression unreadable as he stepped out, holding an envelope in his hand. "It's from Lydia," he said. Harold took it carefully, his fingers colder than he realized, and opened it slowly, unfolding the paper inside with a focus that left no room for anything else. The words were clearer this time, more certain. Lydia had found something. One of the press plants appeared to match a species that had not been documented in the state for over a century. A plant long believed to have disappeared entirely, and Lydia wrote that the find was strong enough to warrant formal review and urgent preservation. It was not proof of everything, but it was proof of something. Evelyn read the letter beside him, her breath catching slightly as the meaning settled in. "It matters," she said. Harold nodded, a faint trace of something returning to his expression, something that had been missing for days. But Mason did not leave immediately. He hesitated, his gaze shifting briefly before he spoke again. "There's something else," he said. He reached into his coat, pulling out a second envelope, thicker, heavier, and held it out without explanation. Harold took it, slower this time, his eyes moving to Mason's face, searching for something that might prepare him for what he was about to read. The offer inside was simple, private, substantial. A collector who had heard, through local whispers already spreading beyond the county, that valuable materials had been found in the cabin. The offer was enough to change everything, with one condition: silence. No university, no publication, no acknowledgement. Evelyn read the words twice, then lowered the paper, her hands resting in her lap as the weight of the decision settled between them, heavier than anything they had faced so far. Because for the first time, the question was no longer about survival alone, but about what they were willing to give up to achieve it, and whether the truth they had uncovered belonged to them or to something far beyond the fragile walls of the cabin. As the wind pressed against the roof once more, the letter did not remain private for long. What Lydia had confirmed, even in part, was enough to move beyond the quiet boundaries of a single conversation, and within weeks, the story began to take shape in places Harold and Evelyn had not expected. A short column in a local paper came first, written after county staff, auction chatter, and Lydia's request for preservation contacts began circling through the same small network of people. Then came a follow-up piece, longer and more detailed, mentioning the cabin at Blackthorn Hollow, the discovery of preserved botanical samples, and the possibility of historical and scientific relevance. It did not name them at first, but it did not need to. Word traveled the way it always had in small communities, quietly at first, then all at once. Mason noticed it in the way people spoke when he stopped for supplies. Naomi heard it from customers who had never once mentioned that part of the forest before. And Harold and Evelyn felt it in the way the silence around them shifted, no longer empty, but expectant. They did not celebrate. They did not assume anything had changed, because inside the cabin, the cold still came at night. The repairs were still incomplete, and Evelyn's strength had not fully returned. But something had moved. Something had begun. The car arrived on a morning that felt almost ordinary. The snow thinner now, the path more visible, the light softer in a way that suggested winter was loosening its hold. Harold heard it before he saw it, the sound of tires moving slowly over ground that had only recently become passable again. And for a moment, he thought it might be Mason, but it wasn't. He recognized the vehicle before it fully came into view. The same one, the same shape, the same distance between him and what it represented. Evelyn stood beside him without being called, her posture straight, her hands still, her expression unreadable in a way that had become familiar over the past months. Daniel stepped out first, his coat clean, his movements confident, as if nothing about this place unsettled him. Claire followed, her face already arranged into something softer, something that could be mistaken for regret if not examined too closely. For a moment, no one spoke. The distance between them held more than just space. "Mom," Claire said finally, her voice trembling just enough to feel intentional. "Dad." Harold did not move. Evelyn did not step forward. They waited. Daniel cleared his throat slightly, his tone shifting into something measured, practiced. "We've been trying to find you," he said. Evelyn's gaze remained steady. "Have you?" she replied. The words were not sharp. They did not need to be. Claire stepped forward, her eyes glistening now, her hands clasped together as if holding something fragile. "We didn't know where you went," she said. "We were worried." Harold's expression did not change, but something in his eyes settled, something that had been uncertain before now becoming clear. "You knew where we were," he said quietly. Claire hesitated just for a second, then she looked down. "I came back," she said, her voice lower now. "That night, after everything." The air shifted. Harold did not interrupt. Evelyn did not move. Claire continued, the words coming slower now, less controlled. "I drove by the house. It was empty. I saw the lights off, the door closed, and I told myself maybe you had gone to a motel or to someone who could take you in. I wanted to believe that because the other possibility made me feel sick." Evelyn's eyes softened slightly, not with forgiveness, but with recognition of something real beneath the surface. "And you left?" she said. Claire nodded, the movement small, almost invisible. "I didn't know what to do," she whispered. "And I was afraid that if I got involved, it would complicate things." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, not because of what had been said, but because of what it confirmed. Daniel shifted his weight, stepping in before the moment could deepen further. "Look, we're here now," he said, his tone firm, redirecting the conversation. "And we want to help." Harold glanced at him briefly, then back at Claire, then finally at the cabin behind them, as if placing each piece in its proper context. "Help with what?" he asked. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if preparing for something that required precision. "This place," he said, gesturing around them. "What you found here, it's important. There are going to be legal steps, paperwork, negotiations. You shouldn't have to deal with that." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "And who should?" she asked. Daniel did not hesitate. "We can manage it for you," he said. "Handle the financial side, the agreements. Make sure you're protected." The word lingered. Protected. Harold let out a quiet breath, something close to a laugh, though no sound followed it. "We've been protecting ourselves just fine," he said. Daniel's expression tightened, just slightly, but he continued. "This isn't the same thing," he replied. "There's going to be funding, possibly grants, maybe even private offers. People are already talking, and once money gets attached to something like this, it becomes complicated." Evelyn's gaze sharpened, not with anger, but with clarity. "Private offers," she repeated. Daniel nodded. "It's normal," he said. "Collectors, institutions, they'll want access. Some of them will pay for exclusivity. We could make sure you get the best deal." Harold looked at him then, fully, his expression steady in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. "And the money?" he said slowly. "Where would that go?" Daniel's answer came too quickly. "We'd hold it," he said. "Make sure it's used properly, managed responsibly." The words settled into place, fitting too easily with everything that had already happened. Evelyn took a step forward then, her movement small but deliberate, her voice calm in a way that carried more weight than anything louder could have. "The first night we were here," she said, "the roof was open, and the cold came through like it didn't even see the walls." Daniel did not respond. Claire looked up, her expression uncertain. "I held your father while he was shaking so hard I thought he might not make it to morning," Evelyn continued, "and I kept telling him it would be all right, even though I didn't believe it myself." Her voice did not break. It remained steady, controlled, shaped by something deeper than emotion alone. "There are different kinds of cold," she said. "Some come from the weather, and some from people who decide you are no longer worth keeping warm." No one moved. Harold stepped beside her, his presence quiet but firm. "I'm not afraid of losing anything anymore," he said, "because the only thing that mattered was already taken." Daniel opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, his expression shifting in a way that no longer felt controlled. Claire looked between them, her eyes filled with something that might have been regret, but could no longer change what had already been decided. And the wind moved softly through the trees behind them, carrying with it a silence that did not feel empty anymore, but final in a way that made it clear there was no path back to what had been before. As Evelyn's hand rested lightly against the doorframe of the cabin, her fingers brushing the worn wood as if grounding herself in something that could not be taken again. The silence that followed that day did not feel empty, and it did not feel uncertain, because for the first time in a long while, Harold and Evelyn were no longer waiting for something to be decided for them. They returned to the cabin without speaking much, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already found its place, and the rest belonged to time. Lydia came back again. This time not alone. She brought with her a small team, people who moved with the same careful attention she had shown the first time, but now there was something more behind their actions. Something steadier, something closer to confirmation than doubt. They examined the structure, the markings, the hidden compartment, the papers, the pressed plants, and they did it slowly, not rushing toward a conclusion, but building it piece by piece, as if the truth deserved to be approached with patience rather than urgency. When Lydia finally spoke to Harold and Evelyn again, her tone had changed, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. "This was their last place," she said, "Elias and Margaret Vale, and the surviving notebooks make one thing increasingly clear. Much of the most original work here appears to have been Margaret's." She simply nodded, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, as if acknowledging something that had been waiting a long time to be said out loud. The recognition did not come with sudden transformation. There were no large announcements, no immediate changes that turned their lives into something easier or brighter overnight. The state reviewed the findings carefully, and after weeks of site visits, preliminary reports, and preservation discussions, what followed was not wealth, but something quieter and more lasting: a modest preservation grant. Enough to reinforce the structure, to close the gaps in the roof properly, to install basic wiring, and a small heating unit that no longer forced them to choose between sleep and survival. Enough to build a system for storing the materials safely, to prevent what had survived for over a century from disappearing now. It was not everything, but it was enough. Harold worked alongside the restoration crew when he could, his movements still slow, his strength limited, but his presence steady. He measured wood again, cut small pieces where larger ones would have once been easy, adjusted angles with patience rather than force, and when he built the first proper shelf inside the cabin, his hands trembled slightly, not from weakness alone, but from the weight of what it meant. He was building something that would last again. Evelyn found her place differently. She sat with Lydia and the others, reading through the notebooks, organizing what could be understood, helping to piece together the story not just of what had been discovered, but of who had been overlooked. When visitors began to come, not many at first, but enough to matter, it was Evelyn who spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not try to impress. She simply told the truth. She spoke about Margaret Vale as someone who had seen what others had missed, who had written carefully, even when she knew her name might not be remembered, who had hidden her work, not out of fear, but out of hope, that one day it would be found by someone who would understand. And when Evelyn spoke, people listened, not because of the discovery alone, but because of the quiet way she carried it, as if she knew something about being unseen and still continuing anyway. The cabin changed slowly, not into something new, but into something that felt whole again. The walls were strengthened, the floor made safe, the roof sealed properly, and the small path leading up to it was clear just enough for others to find their way without losing what made the place what it was. Harold and Evelyn stayed, not because they had nowhere else to go anymore, but because they had chosen to remain. The difference mattered. One evening, after the last visitor had left and the light had settled into that soft, quiet space between day and night, Evelyn sat at the table, a piece of paper in front of her, her pen moving slowly across it. Harold watched her for a moment before speaking. "Writing to them," he said. Evelyn nodded. "Not to bring them back," she replied. "Just to say what needs to be said." She wrote 2 letters, one for Daniel, one for Claire. She did not threaten courtrooms or public shame, though by then enough people in the county knew what had happened that Daniel and Claire no longer moved through town untouched by it. She did not speak about money. She did not speak about what had been gained or lost. She wrote about the night they had been left behind, about the cold that had settled deeper than weather, about the silence that had followed, and about the life they had built afterward, not because of anyone else, but because they had refused to disappear. She did not forgive them in the way they might have hoped. But she did not close the door entirely either. She left it open just enough to define the boundary, to make it clear that respect would be required where it had once been absent. When she finished, she folded the letters carefully, placing them aside without urgency, because whether they were sent tomorrow or later did not change what had already been decided inside her. That night, as they sat together in the quiet, Harold leaned back slightly, his gaze moving toward the far wall, where the mark on the floor had once caught his attention. "You know," he said after a moment, "that day at the auction." Evelyn looked at him, waiting. "I didn't raise my hand because of the house," he continued. She tilted her head slightly. "Then why?" she asked. Harold took a breath, his voice softer now, but steady. "Because I saw you standing there," he said, "and I knew that if I let that moment pass, we would be at the mercy of everyone else for whatever came next. If you sat down, if you let them see you give in, then I wouldn't be able to stand either." Evelyn did not speak. "I thought," he continued, "that if you fell in that moment, then everything we had left would fall with you." He paused, then added quietly, "But you didn't." The words settled gently between them, not heavy, not dramatic, but complete in a way that needed nothing more. Evelyn reached for his hand, her fingers still shaped by years of pain, but steady. And for a moment, neither of them moved, because there was nothing left to chase, nothing left to prove, only the quiet understanding that what had saved them was not the discovery, not the recognition, not even the place itself, but the simple, unbroken decision to remain standing together when everything else had already begun to fall. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more stories like this. Tell me what moment stayed with you the most and where you're watching from.